I was kind of playing a yoga charlatan. It was a performance that had gotten way out of hand and turned into like a 2 year 2 year performance. And this was the one that Joey mentioned earlier at the Centre Pompidou, where I did this fake yoga class and it created this like enormous following of people who thought I was a real teacher. And then I got into a point where I was teaching yoga classes to the employees of the company of electricity of France. Like for them, it felt like happy hour. Like they were in the yoga class and they were just cracking up. I think none of them had ever seen any of their coworkers upside down or wear spandex.
Hello, and welcome back to the MO Podcast, where we dive into the minds of visionary artists, builders, and cultural pioneers. I'm your host, Joey Flores, here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal, and today we are excited to welcome Kathryn Marshall to the pod. Kathryn's work exists at the intersection of movement, storytelling, and audience participation. Marshall has taken her unique artistic language across the world, from New York to Paris to Marseille, crafting performances that turn everyday spaces into stages and unsuspecting audiences into co-creators. Her work challenges perception, often infused with humor, philosophy, and an element of surprise, whether it's a parody yoga class at the Centre Pompidou, a walking tour that's anything but ordinary, or a multimedia performance that dissolves the boundaries between art and life. Kathryn Marshall, welcome to the MO Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So very welcome. Thanks for coming on the show. So Kathryn, for those of our listeners who are not familiar, can you just kick us off by telling us a bit about your artistic practice and maybe highlight one of your favorite past projects or performances?
Yeah, well, with pleasure. Yeah, I think my artistic practice has evolved over the years in direct relationship to like life events, whether they be traumatic or revelatory. And I think a lot of like the big moves I made, I was originally from New York City, and then I moved to Paris, and then I moved to Sri Lanka, and then I was kind of a nomad for several years. Each leg of these journeys has manifested in my art practice. So I think when I was working in New York City, I had a much more concrete form. I was doing large scale installations, and I was kind of working as a carpenter, mostly doing woodwork and building these like elaborate games that were kind of performative in the sense that they were an invitation for the audience to engage in the game of life, but in a conceptual meta artsy way. And then when I moved to Paris, I didn't have the language, I didn't have a studio, I didn't have access to tools, and very limited network. And I think I turned to performance kind of as like a survival kit, like something. I think when you're an artist, you're kind of inhabited. You have this, I guess you could call it like, yeah, some form of energy or spirit that if you don't find a way to channel it, it will eat you alive. So I turned to performance because it was accessible, and I was doing work in this kind of guerrilla way, like in the way in Vietnam where like soldiers would jump out of bushes and just start combat. I was kind of jumping out of bushes and starting performances, and I think I found my way into these big institutions in a very, maybe the French would call it like anarchist. I think for me it was just like a very naive and uh yeah, very naive way where there was an event already going on. So I knew there would be a public gathering, and then I would just emerge and do this performance. And a lot of it was improvised, and then it started slowly taking shape where I would spend a lot of time in these venues and understand the place, and then use that place as like a skeleton for telling a larger story. So using like the architecture, the facets of the space, the public passing through, the way the light falls at a certain hour, the cobwebs, the dust, whatever. And I would slowly weave these into a performance. And then yeah, the work that I do now is I think kind of a hybrid of all my past experiences, whether that be in sculpture, performance, video. I'm also a yoga teacher. I also apprenticed for an Ayurvedic doctor, so I have a background in plant medicine. And I think now these performances are kind of an invitation to, yeah, to jostle your worldview by partaking in an immersive experience that puts into question in a very subtle way your perception. And I think these performances are fueled by my research in neuroscience and anthropology and in cognitive studies, and understanding how the brain works to hack it for the purposes of essentially dismantling the ego and arriving at this place where we are actually here, we're actually present, we're actually experiencing the world through our bodies and not through this lens that is thickened by formatting, by politics, by education, by beliefs, whatever you name it. So I think now I'm not so much coming, I think I'm not performing as like a way to I think before I was like very interested in provoking the public. I was fascinated by their obedience. Like when you arrive in a museum and there's a person who presents as a tour guide, the people just follow. And I think for a long time I was incarnating these roles of like inherently not authoritarian, but like people who had an intrinsic following in the public space, like tour guides, teachers, um, TV hosts, health inspectors, this kind of stuff. And seeing how far I could push the audience into believing this character I was playing to really send back to them the message of like, really? You're obeying me? Why? And now I'm not so interested in this kind of like farcical, ironic provocation. I'm more interested in using humor to just get people to like a base level of openness and elasticity and willingness, and then getting to a place where we can actually kind of, yeah, we can kind of heal each other. Like we understand, we see each other's vulnerabilities, and we share that in a way that feels I don't like the word productive because it's associated so much with like capitalism, and result focused process. But yeah, that the performance has a function. The performance is kind of cathartic and therapeutic, but not in like a woo-woo new age way, even though I do use those tropes a lot. But in a playful way. Like I do a lot of games, a lot of like immersive experiences that draw from my experience in hypnosis, yoga, plant medicine, dance. And then, yeah, we come to a place where we're all kind of vibrating at the same level. And then I can like plant the message like, okay, let's talk about climate change. So, yeah, that was a very long-winded reply, but that's where my practice is now, and I guess a little bit about where I came from.
If I understand the beginnings, at least in France, it feels a little bit like one part Sacha Baron Cohen and one part like single person flash mob.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my inspiration when I was living in New York City, I was actually doing stand-up comedy. And you know, we've spoken about this, but yeah, I was really inspired by the New York improv scene, and I was actually in the New York Improv School, the Upright Citizens Brigade, and yeah, I think when I was 19, 20, I loved that I think had like a YouTube series called Improv Everywhere, where they would like stage, it was a performance, like they would have a scene where a couple would break up in Starbucks and then do it on repeat over and over and over until slowly these people who are just passing through, they keyed into like, wait, I've heard this soundtrack before. And understanding that it's a performance, and like a really like I think for me that was this kind of this doorway that hadn't been opened by my mentors in childhood or anyone in my family who, you know, no one in my family is really in the arts or, yeah, in that persuasion. And like that there's a way to tweak just quotidian situations that permanently affect people in a subtle way. Like if and like this too, they did other interventions, like everybody, like one day thousands of people would get on the New York City metro without pants on. And I think for me that resonates with this saying, I can't remember who said it, but it's like if one person sees a unicorn, they're crazy. If two people sees it, it's a miracle. And oh, I have balloons. And so I like this idea that like this improv group and then through comedy, even Sacha Baron Cohen, oh, this is maybe a real stretch to say this, but it's like they're miracle workers, like performing in the public space in a way that is unanticipated. I really like that space where people aren't always, if they're set up for a performance, then there is expectations. But if they're just like going about their day and then like something is derailed, that I think is a way more interesting space to operate in, at least as an artist that has kind of a penchant for activism. Um, but yeah, I like the earlier performances I did in Paris, I remember like there was a flash mob quality to them because like the first one I ever did, I did at the La Nuit Blanche in this theater called La Gaieté Lyrique, which is like a big major theater in the center of Paris. And the La Nuit Blanche is a night where all the museums and all the galleries are open for 24 hours and there's events across the city, there are concerts everywhere. So it's already like culturally saturated and vibrant. And there was this like sound installation and I just decided, well, this is going to be a space for a performance. And there was a huge gathering of people. And so I started dancing and dancing in dialogue with the sound installation. So I always work in situ. I always work in response to what the site is already presenting me. And it accumulated this huge crowd of people to the point where it surpassed the space's like legal capacity. And then so it attracted like the security guards who were like, what's going on? Like this sound installation has never had so many visitors. It's like, I don't know, ambient noise, whatever. And then they realized like there was somebody illegally performing and they had to like do an emergency exit, like shut down everything, like turn off the lights, shut down the sound, and then escorted everybody out and like dragged me out into the street. And I remember just being like, all right, that's a possibility. And I think if I were like, I don't know, like more in the public eye or a politician, like at that age, I think I was like 22, I would have been mortified. But I think because I am coming from the space of like, how far can you push it? How far can you play with the boundaries of the public space, laws, rules, codes of conduct? How do we, just the fact of like if a door is marked exit, even though it opens both ways, we will only use it as an exit door. We won't walk in. Um, like just little signage, these traces that are vestiges of a previous person's intention. Like, I want this door to be exit only. And then like thousands of people obey that without questioning it. Um, and I understand that that's for the purposes of like better circulation and for public safety. And I know that there are reasons behind it. But I think as an artist, because I'm not working as like a civil engineer, I'm like, well, what if we just twist that a little bit? What happens in people's psyche? Even in people like in their quotidian, like people who work in a company. There was a period I was giving these yoga classes and the top of the skyscraper in Paris called La Défense, which is like the Wall Street business district of Paris. And in this company called EDF, which is the electricity company of France, it's like Con Ed. So they basically are just like the money lords. And there were two very ironic things about this experience. Them having the most money in like all of Europe, they never paid me. They never paid me. Like 2 years chasing down them with an
They were
invoice.
supposed to, though.
Yeah, they were supposed to. I mean, I was in.
That's how they have all the money. This is one of the great secrets of the art and cultural field is that the more money that the entity or the person has, the slower they are to pay.
I'm finding this to be more true every day. I feel like at some point, given my interest in like messing with what I understand to be rules, I wish I could just like get on the other side of it and be like, ah, finally I can make like a lucrative venture out of being hyper observant. But no, I just end up always being the artist who gets played. But
Finish the story about the yoga class on the rooftop or the at the top of the ALF tower.
yeah, like well, they never paid me, but the structure of that site, because I mean, I guess I can go into the story later, but I was kind of playing a yoga charlatan. It was a performance that had gotten way out of hand and turned into like a 2 year 2 year performance. And this was the one that Joey mentioned earlier at the Centre Pompidou, where I did this fake yoga class and it created this like enormous following of people who thought I was a real teacher. And then I got into a point where I was teaching yoga classes to the employees of the company of electricity of France. And what was so strange about that as experience was like the unquestioning, because when you work in corporations, you're also working with a breed of people who are willing to adhere to the man, like a structure. This is the floor you work on. This is the badge you have. These are the doors you have access to. This is your paycheck. This is your company page and LinkedIn. There was like a very different hierarchy there, and the the company hired me for the well-being of their employees, but none of the employees actually wanted to be there. And they were there because they were getting paid by the company to show up to this class because it was during office hours. And I just had this like group of people who were there because they were obeying company orders. But then I think what was interesting for me was that within that class, they were complete shenanigans. Like in every structure, especially I find wherever there's like more like lockdown, like you must do this, you must follow this, people find ways to just be to yeah, save themselves. And I think this is also why I come back to humor now. Like the for them it felt like happy hour. Like they were in the yoga class and they were just cracking up. I think none of them had ever seen any of their coworkers upside down or wear spandex. Um yeah, and it was funny. And also I think for me there was like a moment, definitely like a power, a control moment where I was like, no, I'm here to teach a yoga class and this is completely derailing. And I'm in this like hyper structured, yeah, it felt like I was giving a class at the airport, like on the top of the skyscraper in this super renovated, yeah, penthouse suite area. And the employees were acting like 5-year-olds. So
So you're saying you took on the character of the authoritarian at some point. You're like, wait a second,
exactly,
you are not doing what I'm telling you to do. And if
exactly.
anyone's gonna go off script here, it's gonna be me, not you.
Exactly. And I think that that's why I like live performance because that happens all the time where you're caught in your control loop by the public. And I think that's also where like all the years of improv theater they serve me now because I think yeah, if the audience senses that you have this like rigidity and aren't taking them into account, they're gonna switch it on you and provoke you more. So when tables start to shift and people tune in, like a lot of performances you'll see in the video, like this like this dawning across people's faces where they're like, "Oh, this is a performance." And then they start to like loosen up and like giggle. Um, and then they'll start to feel more comfortable like provoking me back. And I think like I really feed off of that. I really like when the audience kicks back and then I can like rewrite the whole script on site in response to their regurgitation or their just revulsion of an authoritarian figure trying to conduct them in some way.
So maybe that was quite genius on the part of the French electricity company to require some sort of wellness hour for their employees, which presumably lowers their insurance rate or has some sort of functional effect within the larger bureaucracy of the company. But rather than being earnest about what kind of wellness they're going to provide, they decided they were going to do a tweak and have you come in as a kind of para yoga instructor performance. And then even when you have grumpy employees showing up who don't want to be there, all of a sudden they realize that it's not a sincere yoga class, but a somehow a yoga class at one remove, and they begin to they get to be part of the performance, or they're sort of in on the in joke, and they get to misbehave a little bit, and some evil genius at the top levels of the company is like, oh, we have won. The employee morale is increasing.
Exactly. And I think what's so funny and very uncomfortable about what you're saying is like, are we all pawns? I think even and because like the nature of my work started in like a very like guerrilla way where I was not invited, and I really felt, I think when you're young you have a lot more like chutzpah, and you feel like you're above the law in some way, like that's like the lack of development in the frontal cortex. But
Yeah. Up until
um
age 25, you're saying you don't
yeah,
they feel like there's very little to lose.
exactly. But and like you're really resisting. And now like I work with institutions because we live in this capitalistic world. I also need to pay my rent, and the institutions are the ones who are subsidizing performances. It's not really like,
Right.
it's very rare that I will self-produce a performance, although I'm doing it now in Mexico, so that's kind of a cool space. But that also means that you're playing, I mean, now I'm playing to, I had this curator who's the director of the Fondation Cartier. Cartier is those like super fancy watches.
Of course.
And they have a foundation in Paris. And she was like, you're like the object of desire for institutions. Because even though I'm provocative, institutions now will call me in because they know my brand as this like, yeah, farcical museum tour guide, who will take their guests for a ride, but still kindly adhere to the museum's rules and laws. And I think now I'm like trying to break out of that, because I think for so many years, like the tour guide thing started as a very like rebellious thing. And then once it started getting picked up by institutions, like a lot of artists where they get picked up by a gallery and then that helps them survive and make a living off their art, but then they're confined by the expectations of the art market.
Mm.
And I've been feeling that recently. So now I've been trying to break out of that and work in a different way. But yeah, I find there's just so many ironies. Like the only way I can like support all this, you think you're making something monumental or avant-garde, and then you get like pummeled, and you're reminded like, no, I'm just a pawn, I'm just another cog in the machine, and the man is still more greater and more like calculating than I am. The only way
Right.
you can like deal with that is like, I am water, you are oil, and like you bounce it, and you just like, I think in dance too, I find this metaphor really apropos. Like if you fall and you like lock up, you're gonna get injured. Whereas if you fall and like roll with it, you become the fall. It's like you didn't even fall, you just changed levels. So I'm trying to work in that way, where each time I'm like aware of some insidious power operating behind my success or my failures, I'm like, okay, how can we like rope this into the whole thing? How can we make this a game? How can we make this more playful? How can I think this comes from theater improv too. When you're doing a scene, the worst thing to happen if you propose something absurd, like, the scene is, I don't know, somebody's holding their finger and their thumb, and they're like, is that a gun? And the person just says, no, it's my finger and my thumb. Like, the scene is over. Whereas if the person rolls with, they're like, absolutely, and I need like 50,000 euros wired to my bank account before noon, or your whole family will perish. Like then you have a scene, and I think that that's the same way I operate in the art world, where each time I have this like plunder because, like, my God, I've had so many, and also just like with health issues, like. I was slammed with cancer at 23. I was slammed with like autoimmune diseases, death, like so I won't even go into the illnesses that I've been through, and then not to mention the French government, which is just like I think the hardest bureaucracy to to surmount. Getting a visa each year, if I could make the time I've put into obtaining a visa annually, I probably could have had 10 careers in the arts. I mean,
That's
it's
its own kind of performance, I imagine. You should be documenting that entire thing. That's like a Sophie Calle, exhibition.
honestly, yeah, yeah, I'll take it into consideration.
Kathryn, I'm curious. You talked about this, one of your earliest performances that was sort of in this sound installation. And then obviously as the sort of tour guide, you have, I would imagine have gone through exhibitions or showings of other people's art. Do the artists whose works are in these places, so let's say the sound installation artists, are they, did anybody ever find out you had done something inside of their exhibition, or, an artist was there when you were giving a fake tour or whatever? Like, have you had interactions with artists whose sort of expositions were affected by your performance? Like what was that conversation like?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, I think the institution usually manifests in resistance, but the artists were like, oh, hell yeah. Like they were super stoked that somebody had. I don't think when I was performing, I was necessarily moved by that particular artist's work. I hope they're not listening to this podcast now, but something about it did shift to push me to react and perform in that space. And then through the act of performance, because it was then going through the body and not through the mind, I had a deep connection to that artwork, unbeknownst to me. And that performance, usually these interventions were documented. I think when it was in the times of like militant jumping out of the bushes style, on cell phones, and then later like professional captations. But the artists, I would either reach out and just notify them, like, by the way, I'm going to post this video. Your work is in it. Let me know if it poses like a copyright problem. And usually artists would write back and say like, wow, this is so cool. Like we should do a collaboration. I would love to know more about your process. I've always, I think the recurring theme for me is most collaborations usually are with like sound artists. I've done performances in reaction to paintings. Like I was in the Frac Mecca, which is like the big contemporary art museum in Bordeaux in France. And that was in collaboration. I mean, I was invited. It was very like set up. It wasn't a random appearance. And that collaboration was to do a dance choreography in response to the curation, not even just the paintings themselves, but this thing of oh my gosh, I'm having a brain fart. Nicolas Bourriaud, relational aesthetics. So the relations between the paintings, how they were dialoguing with one another, and then I was feeding off of that and making choreography. But usually it's with sound artists, and it's been great. Like I think I kind of want to return to that space where, I mean, it's harder now because I think when you're older, you have more like financial constraints and you need projects to be more delineated. But when I was younger, I was just like, I mean, I used to produce music videos, and I was just making these like fan videos of music artists that I loved. And then I would send them to them, and all of them wrote back to me. And then 3 of them ended up using them as their official music videos. And then one of them invited me on tour with them. And that same artist, like that video when I was 19, I actually got like basically kicked out of art school for making that video because they're like, you're too commercial, like you can't make music videos. So I put it on Vimeo basically as like a sob story, and I'm just gonna store it here because I can't even bear to have it on my own hard drive because it's such a source of shame. And then within 5 days, that video went completely viral, like insane. And then the artist picked it up because obviously like copyright infringement. And he's like, "Oh, I love this. Like, thank you for using my music. Can we use this as the official video?" I mean, I was 19, so I knew nothing about like copyrights, I knew nothing about the law. It got picked up by MTV. It got picked up by Canal Plus. Like I was recruited to do this TV interview about this music video that I had made at 3 in the morning with a friend of mine, in like the attic of the university in this like broom closet. I'm not even kidding. And with no production budget, all we had was like a tablecloth behind us. And then I made these wooden blocks that I had painted and we like synchronized them with the music. Um, and that video just like exploded from a gesture that had no intention of being anything bigger than a broom closet experiment. And and that was like a great, unexpected, like bottle in the ocean kind of experience where you're making something not trying to get attention just because you love the artwork of another person. And then that usually just creates the dialogue of just like, let's talk about what we love and can we work together? And that I think has been like a recurring theme. I don't know that I'm making music videos for free for for anybody and anybody anymore, but I am like reaching out. I think we're now in the age of Instagram, like music artists, and I say like, listen, I absolutely love what you're making, and here's what I do. Can we join forces in some way?
I'm so curious. There's a So you're a very good dancer, and anybody who goes onto your videos or follows your Instagram or has contact, will immediately become familiar with a certain level of capacity for your moving your body in expert ways, right? That I think, let's say, 95%, the probably higher percentage of the population simply either can't do or just doesn't do on a regular basis, right? And this is a function of you being a performer and your body being a major part of your medium. And it's interesting to me that like this conversation about what presents itself as, for lack of a better set of terms to use, either sort of fake or real in the case of, these kind of guerrilla performances, or let's say in the yoga class taught at the Centre Pompidou, um, they they involve, movements of the body which can be apprehended by others as like inherently expert or not.
Mm,
And that has a lot to do with how someone perceives what is happening as kind of valid to be taking place or invalid, right? I mean, I imagine it would be very different for example, in like the yoga class, if you showed up as a kind of, performance, and it's like you had like zero flexibility and you were telling people to do these positions and you could barely even hold them themselves. All I can imagine is like Joey trying to do some of these yoga positions. It's like if Joey is performing this, is acting as that yoga instructor, everyone's going to be like, this immediately is just like not real, right? Like this is fraudulent. But in your case, and it's not fraudulent because it's like you are in fact a yoga instructor. The way that you move your body is highly expert, and so that brings its own level of conviction on the part of an audience. And I can imagine with like the dances to the sound performance and things like that, that sort of brings a kind of level of conviction to people where, and like you said, you had no attachment to the music initially at all, but in the process of performing came to a kind of concordance with that music and presumably a level of performance for you and your dancing or what it is that you were doing in that space, which was then able to kind of be convincing to the people around you, given the crowd that it was able to attract. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic insofar as like there is a moment at which you may approach these things as a performance in quotation marks with a sense of humor, with a kind of sense of irony. And yet there is a kind of honesty that is available to the audience, or a moment that is transmitted that allows the audience or the observers to believe in the kind of reality of what it is they're seeing. And the counterexample that I was all of a sudden thinking of was that the Australian cultural studies professor who then quote unquote performed at the Olympics in the breakdancing competition this last time around, right? Ray Gun, right? And that was kind of the opposite, right? Like there's expertise in the background in terms of the kind of academic and disciplinary background, but the performance itself became this kind of feat of inauthenticity or however you want to present it. But it happened at that point to be on this like amazingly large stage that was highly mediated and broadcast. And so I'm sort of curious for you, like as you've moved out of this kind of guerrilla phase, but even in that kind of guerrilla phase, it seems like there is a kind of, a genuine investment of, rather than kind of pulling back or picking on the frames of reference within which people engage with these performances, which might have been the kind of initial way that people do these guerrilla things. There's a way of coming at it from sort of inside, like the inside out, like doing a yoga class that is sort of, that has a level of expertise such that the barrier between what is performance and what is, or let's say the barrier between what is performative and, I don't know what the other term would be, but like simply doing the thing, right? Like between the performative and the competence or something like that, but that's even not the right distinction. How you've come to kind of think about your practice in relationship to this sort of larger question that we have between perceiving things as being either real or honest versus perceiving things as being, fake, or, and again, in a very benign sense of the word fake, right? Like something that's being done within quotation marks, ironically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you
Sorry
really
to
make
interrupt, but I was just thinking, to sort of add on to Jonathan and maybe nuance that question or something. But like, you talked about this yoga class on the top of the Empire State Building of France, and sort of building on top of what Jonathan said, like, you are a qualified yoga instructor. So like, at what point do people realize it's a performance? Like, like it looks so real and can be so authentic that there's this, maybe there's an extra effort that has to be put into it for people to realize it's not real, because it very much could be real. And I don't know if that was your point, Jonathan, but I think when you have, like you said, the ability to move like an expert in these spaces, to make it clear that it's a parody or that it's a performance, perhaps is actually harder than if I was teaching a yoga class, which, as Jonathan so kindly pointed out, would immediately be seen as a farce.
Well, if to be a farce, it would have to be funny, Joey, and I don't even think it would be funny.
Oh, it would be, trust me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you both point on something that is at the crux of what I'm doing. And I think from like an existential point of view, I think I'm really trying to get at the realness. I'm really trying to use artifice to get to the marrow. But to unpack that, because that sounds very heady. I think you said, Jonathan, this notion of making the performance, even though there is like maybe like a corporeal mastery, or even just the way of speaking. Like I think in a lot of these performances, I draw from method acting where I'm like intensely observing a person in this field, either by like doing understudy or watching YouTube videos or just hanging out in a site for weeks on end. Because I don't want the performative side of the performance to be a distraction. We've all been at shows like stand-up comedy, for example, where the performance the person who's performing hasn't worked on the performative aspect of their performance. It sounds like I'm just rolling dice here, but and that becomes uncomfortable for the audience. They feel a sense of like embarrassment and they don't have faith in the performer's ability to bring them to the larger space that performance can open up. I think there was like my favorite playwright in France, her name is Fia Ménard, and she was saying how like the theater is the temple. Like this is a place where people can believe in anything. You can find the divine. And I think the performer needs to have a certain level of mastery to then destroy all of that. And I think that's that tipping point that I really savor in performances where I've done all these months of study, I've done all this like intensive training, I like work on my body so I can adhere to this this criteria that the performance is requiring, even though I set the bar for whatever the performance requires. And then there's like a breaking point where it's both for me and for the audience, where I break the fourth wall. I think that a lot of these performances are meta performances where I have just enough mastery and rehearsal time and scripting to bring them to this place of trust, even if what I'm saying is completely ridiculous. They're trusting in my ability as a performer, which is different from, the ability of a scientist to talk knowledgeably about string theory. They're similar, but they're different. And then I get to this point, this like teetering space where I think the audience would otherwise get exhausted of this like puppet show and be like, all right, I get the point. Like she's just like a performer. And then I'm like, I find a way to break the fourth wall, whether that's through verbal addressing or usually it's through some physical manifestation of vulnerability where I will peel back a layer and be like, you see, like I have a beating heart too. And I think that we see this in like Disney movies too. There's always like a very reliable pattern and hero's journey, where the protagonist is kind of luminous and invincible, and then there's something that happens that breaks them, and that's where the real learning happens. And what you named, Jonathan, this honesty that makes the performance available to the general audience, and it makes the message universal. It makes them feel like their story is taken into account, that they are not pawns, that I'm not using them to flatter my ego or to parade around town. I think a lot of performers, they make the mistake of just wanting a following. And this is what we're seeing on social media, and I think it's toxic. Right. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that, but I maybe when I was younger, a following was attractive. I think I had like an intoxicating experience where at 19 I had this like sudden burst of fame and was completely caught off guard and didn't know how to handle it, which is probably the best way to be dosed with fame. And then it evaporated, and I think that left this like hunger of like, wow, all this attention can be had. What can I do to get it? And I think when you're like hungry, people can smell that. And when you're genuine, they can also smell that. And I don't really care about a following. I think for me to sit okay with myself at night and sleep at night and operate in this world, whether I'm an artist, a yoga teacher, a daughter, a sister, a charlatan, whatever, I need to know that my intention is, well, this sounds very new agey, but my intention is pure.
Yeah.
That I want to genuinely connect with these people and find a way for them to connect with each other.
I'm very interested too about, you've mentioned it a couple times now, when on the one hand you're like all the kind of woo-woo background and just now new agey. Your bona fides speak to a kind of real interest in the, let's call it a certain kind of, I'm just going to say like California progressive uh, interest. So yoga, plant-based medicine, there's this whole kind of, there's this kind of wrapper that once you talk about it, it comes across that it's there again with a high level of competence, but almost as if you don't quite believe in it at the same level. And I'm sort of curious if that background and your curiosity in these, let's call them all, not even at this point alternative disciplines, it's like alternative mainstream disciplines, follows a similar type of route where, like, rather than sitting on the outside of those and kind of performatively critiquing them, you follow a path straight to the beating heart of them in order to kind of detour them from the inside out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, quite the perception. It's true. And I think for me, they speak of the soul's journey. I think whatever it is that is animating my sack of flesh, that soul needs to do that, needs to live viscerally these domains or subjects or people that I'm interested in. Maybe at the beginning, I'm interested in like harping on or critiquing. And I think like a lot of spiritual teachers will say this, like often what we are critiquing in others is what we need to learn for ourselves. There's a mirror really to what we dislike in ourselves. And I think my original distaste for the new age world, like the yoga performance at Pompidou, was an open critique, a parody of how the yoga industry had been reappropriated by Westerners for lucrative gain. And this whole, like, we know that teacher, like, namaste, like, let your anus breathe light, like, like this kind of talk. And I think I was just like, what the fuck? How?
It's like the goop industrial complex. I can't stand it.
Exactly. And I just so repulsed by it. And I was like, how are people buying into this? And, showing up at New York City hot yoga classes for $40 a pop and feeling like they've opened a portal to the spiritual dimension through, a $300 yoga outfit. And I just like, I found so much issue with it. And then because of my own like health chronics, like I got so desperate. Like I was so sick and I was like physically ill. I was so sick and I had felt betrayed by my own body and I had felt betrayed by modern medicine, and that, yeah, maybe I survived, but the life ensuing these treatments was so unlivable. I was like, well, what is medicine? What is healing? And that, of course, led me to alternative. Of course, it's not, of course, it led me to alternative medicine. Even for me, it wasn't, of course, I kind of fell into it by happenstance. I met this plant medicine background is a total fluke. I met this Ayurvedic doctor randomly, and she intuited what was going on with me was quite dire, and she invited me into her home and basically took care of me for 6 weeks and then trained me as her apprentice for months. And then I got to learn by an act of desperation myself, of trying to find a way to be in this body, not just in this world, but in this body, and not experience so much pain and not experience so much illness, and also just feeling like it's unfair. It's unfair that I can't participate in life. And I think by that, the new age world became my own home. And I love these people. I love like the the Bob Rosses and like the Eckhart Tolles. there's a lot of wisdom there. I think there's a lot of fucked up charlatanism as well. It just take 3 seconds, type in like precious stones on YouTube, and you'll fall into a vortex of like thousands of white women in their living room with stones and talking about how much it's changed their lives. But at the end of the day, I'm just like, whatever works. Like, we're all human. If you're not hurting people, it's fine. I think where I was myself struggling, and then this eventually turned into the cannon fodder for me, what was like my biggest performance. It was my thesis show, and it was a 3-part series, and the first one was called How Can You Know God If You Don't Know Your Own Toes, which is this saying from a yogi master, Iyengar, who basically was saying to his students, like, how can you expect to reach the divine if you can't even be in your own body? Like, the divine is in you, is in your big toe. And get to know that first, and you will understand the greater power, whatever that is. And then that turned into another performance, which then opened for me a big door towards where I'm working now, which is more collective and like theatrical, where I work with a team. And this performance was called My Body is a Temple, and it was a title that was parodying, the new agey saying of like, no, I don't drink alcohol, my body is a temple. Or like, no, I don't fly on airplanes because of the electromagnetic sickness. So I made this performance that basically chronicled, and I think a lot of my performances since then have become that, where it's like a meta-analysis of an individual's journey in a very complex world, like a healing journey. And the individual is me, because I work as a performance artist, so my body is my medium, and it's also how I'm living in this world. And like talking about my own struggle with the confounding information, like what is wellness, and how like access to health is a class issue, and how all the sickness in the body is a mirror of the sickness in our environment. And this notion of, how can we, that was a branch of the, how can you know God if you don't know your own toes? Like, how can you understand climate change if you don't understand your own body? Like, you have the same storms, you have the same ecosystem within you. And when there's an imbalance outside, there's an imbalance inside, and vice versa, an imbalance inside and outside. And I think I always like kind of had a hard time talking about this, because I'm so sensitive to being classified as like the precious stones lady on YouTube. But like, this is scientifically backed, and the more I study medicine, the more I study neuroscience, the more I understand how like neural pathways are created and how perception is constructed. It's not a given. Like, this is a little tangent, but right now I'm in Mexico, and I'm very interested in indigenous practices, and how for centuries tribes or certain cultures have been using ritual or ceremony or plant medicine to, I would say for us as Westerners, we see it as a way of altering perception, altering consciousness. But for them, it's a way of communicating with the divine, communicating with the Great Mother, which usually is more connected to Earth as an entity that is spiritual. And there's this tribe called the Taironi, I believe. Yeah, Tairona, and they're in the Sierra Nevadas in Colombia, and the people are called the Kogi people. And the way that they select the wise men of the tribe, the mumas, is the older mumas of the previous generation, they'll select a baby, sort of like the Dalai Lama. There's like a a spiritual branding on the child, that it's evident that this child has divination powers. And the child will be taken from the mother and then put in a cave for 9 years. And this tribe is still ongoing now. This is the only tribe in Latin America that did not succumb to colonialization. Like, they were able to resist that. And they've been living the same way for thousands of years. And this child will be living in the cave and is fed just enough food to stave off starvation and just enough light so they don't go blind. And then these older mummas are coming in and giving them like teachings on how to communicate with the Great Mother and hone in on their divination skills through meditation and focusing the mind. And then the child at age 9 emerges into the light in the world for the first time. And just the way that perception, like the way we perceive things, is because we've had kind of a reliable environment. We have the sun rising and sun setting, we have the moon, we have the stars, we have up, down, we have gravity. We have things that our brain is constantly logging to slowly define what we deem as real. And this child has a completely different relationship to what is real. And what's ironic is that the child will attest to having seen all the same very things that we see with our eyes and with our five senses before ever being exposed to that. So there's this idea of like reality is like a universal, like consciousness is something that is not necessarily rooted in the tangible world, that the tangible world has just as much realness in an esoteric, meditative trance space. And I feel like for me, I was like sitting with that and I was just trying to think like, God, what must that feel like to see the world for the first time? And this reminds me of when I was a teenager, I went and lived in this artist community in California, and we were essentially guided on how to like work as a professional artist when we were 15. So like your work is guided by research. And I was working with another artist and we were both fascinated by perception. And she was doing studies on blind people who, there were two groups. There were people who were born blind and then by a surgical intervention regained sight at like age 50. And then people who, trying to remember. Yeah, I guess they had sight and then they lost it and they were given back. But the testimonials that come to my mind right now were the people who were given sight suddenly later in life. And speaking of, like seeing their own face for the first time, seeing their husband, their wife, their parents for the first time, and nothing correlated to the reality that they had constructed without that sensory input. To the point where it was so frightening that like 80% of these people ended up choosing to go back, like reverting the surgery. And also they describe, with regards to perception, they described a staircase. So like we understand a staircase like goes forward and up. Whereas a blind person, they've never developed depth perception. They see a staircase as this like impenetrable, towering edifice. And their lived visceral experience of a staircase has nothing to do with that visual. And I just like, I think since then, I've always been like fascinated, like, wow, okay, perception is a question of habits. It's a question of neural patterns and enough like repeating events that we're like, okay, this is a wall, this is a ceiling, this is a staircase, this is dangerous, this isn't. And that's just not true. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Like it can be altered.
Yeah, I think, shockingly, I'm very sympathetic to this entire line of questioning about the conventions of perceptual reality. And I think a lot of what you have been describing has kind of like nicely unlocked itself from what people think of as the kind of like woo-woo, alternative spiritual paths that have been followed probably for 50 to 70 years as a kind of artifact of our sort of newly globalized environment, that goes kind of hand in hand with what you were talking about in terms of the kind of creation of the yoga industrial complex, and also a sort of increasing interest in the kind of spiritual journeys that people want to take. But from the standpoint of the actual sort of interaction between Western science, computer science, and these sort of alternative ways of thinking about the perceptual domain, there's like a lot of really good, interesting research that has to do about, okay, so the capacity for one to meditate and have a meditation practice that allows you to sort of undo the constraints of the ego built up over years of perceptual habit that give you a sense of yourself in the world in a certain way, but a meditation practice can undo those boundaries to a certain extent, the same way that these days certain pharmaceuticals can, right? So there's one thing to be one of these, Silicon Valley D-bags who's off doing ayahuasca journeys, left and right and talking about it at Burning Man. It's another for someone to say, there's an actual way of using some of these psychedelics to essentially accelerate or say short circuit the same outcomes that one gets from a kind of meditative practice of being able to undo some of the sort of the habits of mind. I was listening to, I can't remember the interviewee's name, but I think Sam Harris, the writer and podcaster, had him on some months ago. But there's real interesting overlap now in the science of artificial intelligence, of the question of simulations and how the math and the way that a lot of the models for artificial general intelligence are building these kind of probabilistic versions of the world that then get matched to the how it is that the organism, in this case the AI or human beings, sort of experiment against that model of the world, which makes sense to extent, Kathryn, what you were just saying. You have these habits that you create of perception, which is about how do you navigate floors and ceilings and danger, which is all a very important way for the organism to sort of make its way through the world without, having to constantly sort of rethink, oh, I have come to a step, what would happen if I step down? How do I move my body in order to be able to navigate this change of elevation? And but there is a sense that is just a model that has been built of this external reality in order to allow the organism to function as efficiently as possible. And the computer scientists are running up against this, I guess they call it the free energy problem. It's like the brain has to process all of this stuff using a certain set of constraints, only so many calories that it can take in and only so much energy that it can use, and it has to be efficient. Right. And rather than having to like run those computations entirely every single time, it comes up with a model and then frames its relationship to the world based on that model, not based on any sort of actual reality every time. And so I'm super sympathetic to that entire way of thinking about it. But I always come back to then this like, it the sort of shamanistic, the alternative, the sort of spiritual aspects of it, I think always sort of hold out this hope for some sort of more either intuitive or inherently connected or grounded or more balanced approach to a kind of equilibrium between the human in the world, the human in the environment, the body and its extents. And I don't know, perhaps the Dalai Lama is supposed to be held up as the example of the sort of supremely enlightened individual, or maybe there are these sort of yogis that exist throughout the land that, have this kind of relationship to this total obliteration of the ego and a sort of sense of equanimity with everything that's going on. But then I think, but those guys aren't like making the coolest art or it's like, like what does that like it always seems to be some sort of background condition or goal that is part of this interest. But I guess at the where do where do you take that for your own interests and projects against that kind of background? Again, like I think enlightenment for its own sake is very important, education for its own sake is very important. Perhaps there's a sense of sort of spiritual enlightenment which is very, important for its own sake. Let's take that as granted. But then what do you do with that, right? How does that make its way into, like, what are the performances? What is it that you need to communicate or to mediate to others? Is the goal the sort of great collective utopian spiritual awakening in which everyone is sort of at one with the world, which I think that, like, I, always again sort of seems to fall into the trap door of sort of woo-woo spiritualism, and just seems like that's not the way it's going to work, because I don't know, those people seem to get in the same number of flame wars online with one another. And it's like they don't seem any more or less well adjusted than your sort of average beer drinking baseball watching American. Perhaps I'm wrong, but who knows. So I guess the larger question is, like, where do you see this going for your practice in terms of its kind of, what I appreciate is its kind of always willingness to sort of harness that original sense of humor and wryness, to throw up a set of quotation marks in order to be able to get that parallax view and call something into question.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the questions you're asking. I resonate a lot with them, and I think they're questions I ask openly, whether to myself or to the audience. And absolutely, I think I didn't speak about this, but I'll speak about it because it will in a way answer your question. I think myself, I went off the spiritual deep end at a certain point where I I think I mean I was really desperate. I think I really needed, like a lot of people who get very spiritual, something very grave happens to them. And it shakes up their life and they need something to hold on to. They need hope. Um, and I think in the paths that I was walking down, which were much more linked in like Eastern spirituality and yoga and Buddhism, I got kind of obsessed with the idea of enlightenment. And I was like, I completely threw my whole life out the window, all of my relationships, my family, like I wasn't in a cult, but my behavior was like one of a person in a cult, where cults are successful because they sever the ties between that person and their what they've known as reality and their people. And I was meditating anywhere between like 2 and 8 hours a day. And I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. And I stopped sleeping and I was living like a very ascetic existence, and every action that I had needed to be for the good of others. Like myself was negated, and I think I was really taken by the Buddhist notion of karma, and I think like in like the spiritual the people who are more like, because there's Buddhism is not a religion, it's a
Right,
path.
right.
And then there are people who are religiously Buddhist, and they're very different. And they believe in karma as like the way Catholics believe in sins. Like you need to like
Right.
pay
There's like a
back.
balance. It's like an economics of spiritual life.
Exactly. And I think I got so deep in that. There was a point where I recognized that I had lost myself. I recognized that I had no more joy. I was just like going through these motions in the hopes of arriving on the other side of the portal, and then the enlightenment would actually make my life better. And at some point there was this like shift, an awakening of like, actually, I'm already on the other side of the door. This is enlightenment. The being incarnated is like, there isn't a better life waiting for me on the other side. And maybe there is, but I won't know and it doesn't matter because this is the life I'm in now. And that's where I came back to art. And I think you speak of these shamans, like, yes, they're connected to the Great Mother and they can divine things, and they're not making any art. I mean, maybe there's like some, I mean, that's not fair to say, but the way that they're expressing themselves is not in a provocative way. It's more in like a management way, like managing.
Right.
They're they're managing the relationship between man and nature. They're managing the relationship between the spiritual world and the concrete world.
Right.
And there are these bridges. I think artists, they have this particular power to alchemize. And you need to have a wisdom of like knowing what is your research and what is your art. I think for also a long time, I thought that my art was a way to just like regurgitate my research.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. It has to pass through you. I think other artists have different ways of channeling this, but there's a chemical reaction that happens, and the resulting material is resembles nothing like the
Yeah.
initial materials.
Yeah.
And I think because I tasted those spaces of like spiritual appetite and spiritual disappointment, um and also profound mystical experiences that will never leave me. And I think that's why now the work that I'm doing is so much more focused on the community, because this thing of like chasing this ethereal realm of a potential better afterlife, or a potential space where you have no ego, you are nothing, that is very distancing. And we're here, at least in these, like in the caste, in this species, whatever like way you want to phrase that, um we're here to be together. And I think that's also why I have this like repugnance. I'm understanding better why I like had that like mouth vomit of those like narcissistic navel gazing YouTube yoga teachers who are like, I did my yoga teacher training in India and now I'm a guru. I think for me, in this world where we're so consumed by social media, so consumed by our image, we're never had as much stimulus ever in the history of time. We're so self-obsessed and individualistic, and we lose sight of the bigger picture, which is like we're all like we got to work together, and we're
Yeah.
happier when we are connecting and communicating.
Yeah, I agree. Although I also often get the sense from the art world, in particular, art and cultural in general, that it's like there has been a refrain of an interest in community and community practices, social practices of one sort of another, that, that box it somehow or turn it into a product somehow and lose, I think, what you were describing as um, something of the impulse that is about getting outside of something of the individualized practice that is focused on the self and engaging with a larger community. And but sometimes that can look just as much like a kind of product as the sort of individualized sense. And so I which is a way of voicing this sort of, I definitely see and appreciate that motivation. It's like it's very complicated because there's also these moments where I think of like, oh, but there are these, some artists who like at this like supreme levels of narcissism and total focus on the self are able to somehow turn themselves inside out and reach the universal, right? Like, and produce something that is able to resonate across boundaries between human beings, groups, eras, and still speak in that way, right? Like,
Yeah.
not to be totally cliche, but it's like Shakespeare is not engaged in a a community centered social practice, even though it was the theater. You know what I mean? There is a sort of reaching into the sort of depths of your own humanity and being able to pull out whatever that universal kernel is that you don't get from sitting around the coffee shop and having better conversations with Samuel Johnson or something like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're exclusive. I
Yeah.
think I think you can be a narcissist and connect with people.
Yeah, yeah. You could be a narcissist and a collectivist. You could be a narcissist and a social democrat.
I think in the case of an artist, I mean, a politician, I think it's a very different uh, conversation. But like in the case of an artist, because they're working from their sensitivity, they're working
Sure.
from their heightened,
Yes.
yeah,
Their
heightened sensitivity,
their
and
illnesses.
yeah,
Yeah.
and what makes them or breaks them. And
Yeah.
like I think when you're sensitive, you're more porous, and which is also why like a lot of artists are kind of agoraphobes. Like you take in a lot,
Yeah.
and this thing where I was speaking about alchemizing, like even these narcissistic artists, if if they know how to channel like a lot of these great ideas, these things of the universal, um it's not something that, at least for me, I think, and then there was like a TED talk about this, not to be like that kind of referencing like chirping hummingbird, but like she spoke about the genius as something that visits you,
Sure.
and where you create like the trying to think the French word of this, like propitious, like the favorable circumstances
Hmm.
hold it, because otherwise it will just visit you and pass through.
Right. Right.
You want to serve it tea and have it stay for
Yeah.
but
It reminds me, I can't remember, I was having a conversation with an artist about this, but the one of the last books by Cormac McCarthy, he published these two together, and the one is called Stella Maris, and it's a series of dialogues between a character and her therapist, and the character is this young woman who is schizophrenic, and she is in a facility, and I think it's supposed to be sometime like the 70s or 80s. I can't remember if I'm getting that timing right. But this is a character who suffers from, what we think of as kind of mental illnesses and derangements, and has hallucinations, and sees these figures that she interacts with and have conversations with, along with having conversations with her therapist. But she's also a brilliant mathematician, right? And part of the character's backstory is that she, is one of these sort of great, able to make sort of incredible contributions to the discipline of math. And those contributions in her mind, and again, speaking this from the standpoint of the character, because these are all sort of fabrications by McCarthy, is that they are not, she talks to the therapist, they're not things that she creates, they are things that she discovers in the world, because, what is math if not this kind of platonic realm of relationships that are sort of out there, and you need to have another way of thinking or seeing or perceiving the world in order to be able to be open to what those discoveries are. And when she was doing her best work in one of her manic phases, it simply came on as transcribing something that she was able to see anew, rather than something that she herself was able to generate or create. And I'm doing a bad job of paraphrasing, because great art can't be paraphrased. But as far as a portrait of what we think of as a kind of creative process that registers within a larger discipline, and again, math is different than art, but I think that there's some parallels. It's probably one of the better recent descriptions of what that might look like, right? At the same, in terms of that, in terms of the kind of how, you use the word porous. It's hard to describe, fractured or fuzzy at the margins one's self might need to be in order to gain access to a kind of perception that allows for the production of a kind of work, either art or mathematics or some other quote unquote creative field, that does represent a genuine contribution to the pushing of the limits of that field into new territory.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think right now where I am in my research, there's a lot of stuff I'm uncovering that is exactly about this. This speaking of, universal consciousness, entangled consciousness, telepathy. There is this whole podcast series called the Telepathy Tapes, which I was told about because I had confided in someone that I had once experienced a telepathic experience, which I thought that it was me going insane, schizophrenic. And the fact that the person I was communicating with me cycled back and said the next day, I got your message, and sent me the photo that I had asked her to send me via my brain, thousands of miles away. I kind of logged that experience and kept it for myself, and then was speaking about it with a transpersonal psychologist, and she was like, "Oh yeah, telepathy that's a thing." And they go to, it's mostly about autistic people,
Mm.
and these like severely autistic children who are nonverbal, and the fact that they're nonverbal also means that they have hyper developed other sensitivities. And with recent technology, that these kids are now able to communicate, not verbally, but they can spell. So there's like an iPad app, and they can basically pick letters and they can communicate. And for these families, it's been completely groundbreaking because the mother understands for the first time the personality of their child, even though as a mother they know their kid in a way that, clinicians can't. And the reason this show started was because these uh there was a neuroscientist. A lot of neuroscientists know about this, but they're not allowed to talk about it because they will lose their license because it's so taboo. But one who was like openly dedicating her research to telepathy, these mothers were reaching out to her unbeknownst that this was happening to all autistic mothers, writing frantically, being like, "My child can read my mind. Like, can you explain this to me? What's going on? Like, I'm desperate for information." And then basically this, at least for this podcast series, and I think there's a lot of artists who write about this. There's a lot of psychologists, neuroscientists who write about it, and Aldous Huxley writes about it too. Um, what's nice about this is a condensed format where you can go through the series and listen to each testimonial where she goes to the households and they perform a various amount of experiments, proving in the initial phases, it's just proving like, oh my gosh, my child can read my mind. And having like the mother looking at a screen with a number that's like 6,000 digits long, and the kid is in the other house and can recite every digit. And once they got the kids speaking, the kids started saying, well, yeah, of course I speak with my friends telepathically. We go to this place called the Hill, and that's where we communicate, and that's where we get knowledge. So these savants, kids who are at age 5 and suddenly they understand Arabic and quantum physics and complex algebra, whatever, they are drawing from this like Wikipedia page in the ether. And I think people who are classified, this is why I got interested, this project in Mexico, it was originally a project that was around the whole world, where I was examining indigenous societies that had a practice which was about addressing mental health through dance or through ceremony. So people in our society that would be ostracized and put into a mental asylum and identified as schizophrenic or whatever and medicated to the gills. In these societies, they don't see it that way. They see it as a person who has either like hypersensitivities and needs to be trained as like a shaman, or has lost the social, like a link to their community. So the ceremony that they perform, the one I'm thinking of in particular, is called the Vimbuza dance, and it's in Malawi. And they basically perform this like elaborate dance ceremony around this identified person. And it's public, it's performative, it's very joyous, and also kind of violent, like in the sense of like shaking and fumigation and drumming and like physical exhaustion, and yeah, lots of things going on, and costumes. And the person is slowly brought back into the the social circle in the physical realm. And there are other practices and also in like Zapotec culture in Oaxaca. They talk about this, I think it's called sucio. I have to look at my research. I can't remember the name of it, but basically, they have this whole ceremony around what happens when somebody's been frightened, like there's too much cold in the body from fear, from trauma, from literal physical coldness, and there's an imbalance, and they perform these rituals to bring that person back into balance, and they work. And I think like what you're saying, I mean, I am not the mother of an autistic child, but I have borne witness to it. Like it would be so unfair. I think in the 60s, we saw the horrors of this, like in these horrible experiments where they were electrocuting people who were shown to be schizophrenic or manic. And like, if we could learn from not just autistic children, but these indigenous societies where those illnesses are not an illness of that person. It's an illness of the society, an illness of misinterpreting their sensibilities as as a lack, as a problem, and seeing it more as like an invitation to put back into question, oh, what is real and what is perception? Yeah.
All right. Well, Kathryn, not to take an abrupt turn here, but at the end of our podcast, we have another segment called the More Opinion segment. And so, Kathryn, if someone gave you $10 million in budget to launch either a project, an enterprise, just something ambitious and big, you can't take the money and run. What would you want to create or build with $10 million?
Are there parameters? Like, can it be linked to what I'm doing, or does it have to be something?
It has to be somewhat of a departure from what you normally do. It can't be just like, oh, I would invest in like a huge studio or make my community practice like a whole center or whatever. But I mean, something getting out of your comfort zone.
I think initially my response to that would have been like, oh, I really want to build like a dance center up in the mountains that's like a glass building up in the mountains where people can commune with nature and dance and work with light. But
I think that's acceptable.
Yeah. I mean, I think like now I have like $10 million. I don't know. I wish there was a way that money could be used for, I heard there was like some like health podcast that I was listening to. He's like, oh, like ashwagandha and also like psychedelic mushrooms should be in the water supply. Like if I could use $10 million to put some psychedelics in the water supply in a couple of major cities, I would do that.
Just microdosing an entire population. Let's see what happens.
$10 million buys a lot of mushrooms. I know that much.
Well, you have to also buy like the whole, Mission Impossible infrastructure to get it into the water supply, and then, keep it going for at least enough time that you can monitor what the results would be.
Yeah, that'd be a really crazy, very illegal, very fringing up people's private. Yeah, but
it seems like something. It seems like something that is going to be happening in standard practice down at, SpaceX in Texas with Elon Musk and,
already happening.
Yeah, it's already, exactly. The future is here. It's happening somewhere.
I mean, probably AI, AI uses a shit ton of water. Maybe there's definitely some things.
That's right. You can microdose the AIs. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Not to derail the company.
Right?
Yeah. Well, it's already hallucinating, but also, what's his face from OpenAI tweeted a screenshot. Tweeted a screenshot asking, about whether the AI thought that it would or could achieve consciousness, and the AI's response, Kathryn, was very much in the vein of, consciousness is universal and the physical world is just a sort of subcategory of whatever this kind of universal consciousness is. It was like a fairly out there response. So it was, and he screenshotted this coming from GPT-4, whatever the newest version was. So I was like, all right, so, the GPTs are already there.
Yeah.
Crazy. We live in the
Scary
future.
times.
Yeah.
All right. Second question, Kathryn. I believe we prepared you for this one. It's the only one we usually send in advance, but is there a project or person in the art and cultural sector who's working on something you admire and would like to bring more attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this person needs more attention, but I've referenced her before, this playwright Fia Minard. She's a queer, a trans woman producing these sort of immersive theater pieces that put into question. I mean, I think she draws a lot from her anecdotal experience of struggling, of being in a body that was not her own, like that she didn't call home, and then turning it into this like gargantuan, monumental, epic theater productions that really bring you on an existential ride. And I think it's the only shows I've ever been to where I've left feeling physically and emotionally, psychologically, spiritually changed. And they're very, there's very little dialogue. It's I don't know if you ever remember as kids that video game Myst. Or the
Maybe
Y.
by name, but I'm not
Yeah,
doing
I just wrote about having played Myst in the 90s when it came out for another piece of writing about another video game work that was just up here in the Bay Area. But yeah,
so you know what I'm talking about.
absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of the like eerie spaces where you're reminded of the dream realm in an uncanny way, so uncanny that you end up questioning the divide between dreaming and reality. And these spaces where you have you kind of like the hero's journey thing, like you have a mission, but it's very hard to uncover what that is. Like in the Myst space, it would be like, oh, you need to like pivot this rock 30 degrees and look towards the canoe and then lift the paddle ever so slightly, and then a portal will open. Like none of these things, how did they even come up with this game? I think like what's so impressive about her is that she's managed to transpose that experience that you have in lucid dreaming, because it's not just dream space, like lucid dreaming where you're aware that you have agency and something needs to be done, and you're trying to find a way to open that door. And she really beautifully, eloquently, scenographically recreates that in a non it's not a one-to-one binary way. Like I think it's only after seeing multiple pieces of hers that I draw that conclusion of like, oh, she's probably creating from like subconscious places. And yeah, they're symphonic, like there's music, they're extremely epic for the senses, but also very simple. Yeah, I don't know if she would ever tour in the States, but I recommend full-heartedly.
Cool. All right. Last question of the show. If you could steal any work of art or cultural artifact from around the world to have for your own enjoyment only, you could never sell it. Most people could never know that you've stolen it. What piece of work would you like to have, or cultural artifact for your personal enjoyment in your home?
I think I would want the Rosetta Stone.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're gonna at some point put out a list of all the stolen things that from the people's answers to the show. But so that's a great one. We've had the Rosetta Stone. Last time we had Beethoven's piano.
You got that already?
No, we didn't have Rosetta Stone before. That's new.
No, Rosetta Stone, brand new. So never heard that one. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, Kathryn Marshall, thank you for coming on the MO podcast and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed speaking with you.
You too. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.